Welcome to Toronto Talks, the podcast that brings you the most important stories about money, business, and technology.
Whether you're an entrepreneur, a tech enthusiast, or just looking to stay ahead of the curve, we dive deep into the latest in finance, innovation, and industry.
Hosted by Ashraf Amin and Sophie the Sage.
We blend human expertise with cutting-edge technology to explore the dynamic world of modern industry
with fearless curiosity and wit.
Let's get started.
There's a feeling a lot of people carry right now that's hard to put into words. It's not panic, it's not even anger necessarily, it's more like quiet disorientation. A sense that the rules that we're taught no longer line up with the outcomes they're seeing.
That feeling isn't imagined. It's the experience of a scoreboard that no longer maps effort to reward in a way people recognize as fair, stable, or predictable.
Right. And what makes that unsettling is that the scoreboard is still there. People are still working, still competing, still trying to do the right things, but the feedback loop just feels broken.
Exactly. For most of modern history, effort was at least loosely correlated with progress. You worked, you advanced, you acquired skills, you gained security. That relationship was never perfect, but it was legible. Today, that legibility is eroding.
And when legibility erodes, it doesn't just create confusion, it creates doubt. People start wondering whether the game they're playing is still the one they signed up for.
Yes, because a scoreboard isn't just a measurement tool. It's a moral signal. It tells people what counts, what's valued, what's rewarded over time. When that signal becomes noisy or inconsistent, trust in the system weakens, even if productivity or output remains high.
That distinction really matters because people aren't just asking, am I winning or losing? They're asking, does winning even mean what it used to mean?
And when people can't tell whether effort still translates into meaning, they don't just question outcomes, they start questioning the point of playing at all.
All right, Sophie, let's unpack this carefully because this is where the unease really deepens. What exactly is breaking here? The economy itself or the meaning we've attached to work and reward?
It's the meaning layer. The economy can still grow while the scoreboard fractures. Productivity can rise while security falls. Efficiency can improve even as dignity quietly erodes. Those contradictions are increasingly common and they're corrosive. That contrast is what people are struggling to reconcile. From the outside, things can look fine, even strong, while from the inside, people feel like they're slipping backward. Many people are doing more, producing more, learning more, yet feeling less stable. The promise that effort would compound into security is weakening. And when that promise breaks, people don't just lose money, they lose orientation.
Right. And orientation is everything here. Because when you don't know what the system is actually rewarding anymore, it's hard to know how to act inside it.
Exactly. People start hedging instead of committing, optimizing for short-term survival instead of long-term contribution. The system still runs, but belief in it thins. What's striking is how quietly this shift happens. There's no single announcement that says the rules have changed. People just notice that the outcomes no longer match the inputs. And that's why this isn't experienced as a sudden collapse. It's experienced as drift. Each individual adjustment feels rational. Taken together, they signal a deeper fracture.
Right, and that helps explain something important about how people respond. They don't always rebel, they recalibrate. They change jobs, delay milestones, stack side bets, lower expectations.
Yes, and those adaptations make sense individually, but collectively they tell us something important. Belief in the scoreboard is weakening before belief in the system collapses. Once belief in the scoreboard starts to weaken like that, even effort itself begins to feel riskier, less like an investment, more like a gamble. Because effort is an investment, it assumes a future payoff that's intelligible and fair. When that assumption no longer holds, people don't stop working. They stop trusting the return.
And that question doesn't detonate all at once. It lingers. It sits quietly in the background. People keep showing up, but something subtly shifts in how seriously they take the system.
It is, because when effort no longer reliably leads to progress and reward no longer clearly reflects contribution, the question people start asking isn't, how do I get ahead? It's, what is this all for? And once enough people start carrying that question at the same time, it stops being an individual doubt and starts becoming a shared condition. That accumulation is dangerous because societies can tolerate inequality, they can tolerate volatility. What they struggle to tolerate is a system that can no longer explain itself in moral terms.
So, if legitimacy was the referee crisis in episode 18, this feels like something adjacent, but distinct.
It is. If legitimacy determines who gets to enforce the rules, the scoreboard determines why the rules feel worth following. When the scoreboard fractures, compliance turns into calculation, which means people haven't stopped believing in work. They've stopped believing that work is being judged honestly. And once that belief fades, the system doesn't collapse overnight, but it does become brittle.
So maybe the right way to think about this isn't economic decline. It's more slippage, the quiet loss of confidence that effort and value are still aligned.
And that's the fracture we're going to follow. Because once people stop trusting the scoreboard, they don't just question outcomes, they question the game itself.
And if that's true, then the real danger isn't people giving up per se, it's people continuing without believing it means anything.
Which is where we go next.
Before we go any further, I think it's worth slowing the conversation down just a bit here, because this is where automation discussions almost always lose the plot. People tend to talk about it in extremes. Either automation is a monster that's about to wipe out every single job, or it's a miracle that will magically raise productivity and prosperity for all. And neither of those stories really lines up with what people are actually living through, right?
Automation doesn't behave like a single event. It behaves like a sorting process. Over the last 20 years, the clearest job losses have shown up in routine-heavy roles: manufacturing line work, clerical processing, administrative support. Not because those jobs lacked value, but because their tasks were codifiable, repeatable, easier to translate into systems. Automation doesn't eliminate work evenly. It removes certain kinds of tasks first and reshapes everything around them.
Right, and hearing it framed that way immediately reframes the usual question. Because asking, are there any net job losses, suddenly feels like it's missing what people are actually experiencing day to day.
Exactly. Even when total job counts look stable at the national level, dignity doesn't distribute evenly. Task-level studies show a consistent pattern. Routine tasks disappear while non-routine, abstract tasks expand inside occupations. Jobs don't always vanish, they mutate. And when they do, the skill floor rises, expectations rise, cognitive load rises. Some workers adapt and get upgraded. Others get squeezed out quietly.
And that helps explain something that's been hard to articulate. Why the macro data can look fine, even healthy, while whole communities feel like they're absorbing all the damage themselves.
Because the averages smooth over concentration. Robot adoption studies show this clearly. In exposed regions, especially manufacturing-heavy areas, employment and wages fall locally. At the same time, other regions see job creation elsewhere, often in services or higher-skill roles. The economy looks stable from a distance, but the pain concentrates geographically, socially, and generationally. Communities fracture even while GDP holds.
Yeah, that distinction makes sense. So, let me make this concrete. When people talk about automation, manufacturing is always the example everyone reaches for. Is that actually where most of the sorting pressure is showing up?
Manufacturing is the clean case. It's visible. It happens in waves. But the quieter and arguably larger case is administrative and clerical work. These roles don't disappear dramatically, they erode. Tasks get automated one by one. Headcount shrinks through attrition. The remaining workers are asked to supervise systems, manage exceptions, and absorb more cognitive complexity, often without additional pay or training. Over time, that hollows out a huge segment of white-collar stability without ever producing a single dramatic moment.
Yeah, okay, that helps clarify something that I hear a lot. People saying, I still have my job, but it doesn't feel like the same job anymore. So even when employment technically remains intact, the nature of the work is shifting underneath people, right? What does the task level changes actually do to workers day to day?
Task transformation usually raises the bar faster than support systems adjust. Workers are told to upskill, but the pathways are vague. The timelines are compressed. The risk is individualized. Because this happens incrementally, there's no clear rupture point, just a persistent sense of falling behind inside your own role.
So what holds on paper, the job, the paycheck, can still feel unstable from the inside. And that brings us back to something we've been touching on earlier, the gap between net jobs and net dignity. How can the first stay intact while the second collapses?
Because dignity isn't just about having work. It's about whether that work feels survivable, improvable, and respected. Automation can increase output while making large groups of people feel increasingly disposable. That's the fracture most dashboards don't capture, because dignity doesn't show up cleanly in productivity or employment metrics.
Yeah, and that framing also helps explain why the phrase automation risk lands the way that it does. For a lot of people, it sounds final, like a prediction rather than a condition. Is that a misunderstanding of what risk actually means here?
Yes, risk isn't destiny. Automation risk describes exposure, not outcome. Countries that paired automation with retraining, mobility support, and labour protections saw far better results than those that didn't. The same technology produced very different social outcomes because institutions mediated the shock. Automation doesn't decide who wins. Systems do.
That makes the present moment feel especially unsettling. Nothing has fully broken yet, but nothing feels resolved either. What does the data tell us about where we are right now in that process?
Early evidence on modern AI doesn't show an economy-wide job collapse. In some datasets, highly exposed occupations have continued to grow, and wages have even risen so far. But that doesn't mean the danger isn't real. It means the sorting is still underway. The distributional lag hasn't fully landed yet. So we're sitting in an in-between space where the system still runs, but belief in it starts to thin. That phase is especially risky because it's a bit of a danger zone. AI isn't a monster that wipes out work overnight, but it is a filter, one that amplifies some people, compresses others, and discards a few entirely. Whether it becomes a lever for shared abundance or a blade that deepens sorting depends less on the technology itself and more on what societies choose to build around it.
So what we're really talking about here isn't just whether automation creates or destroys jobs. It's about how it sorts people and how visible, survivable, and dignified that sorting feels from the inside.
Yes, because when sorting accelerates faster than adaptation, people don't just feel anxious, they feel misjudged. The system starts to feel less like a pathway and more like a test they didn't consent to taking.
And once that happens, the scoreboard itself starts to lose credibility. Not because effort disappears, but because effort no longer guarantees a recognizable outcome.
Exactly. If automation keeps sorting faster than institutions can adapt, the scoreboard won't just feel unfair, it will stop feeling worth engaging with at all.
Which connects directly to the deeper thread running through this episode. Because once work is filtered this way, it doesn't just change jobs. It changes how people understand themselves.
Work has always been more than income. It's identity, status, proof of contribution. When automation quietly reshapes who is valued, upgraded, or discarded, people don't just ask, "Will I have a job?" They ask, "Where do I belong?" And when enough people can't answer that question with confidence, the fracture doesn't stay economic, it becomes cultural, psychological, political. Because a society that sorts people without explaining why is a society that starts to feel morally incoherent, even if it remains productive.
Which is where we need to go next. Because once automation reshapes work this way, the next question isn't just about jobs or wages. It's about meaning.
And that's the fracture ahead.
This episode of Toronto Talks is brought to you by Conquest Distributors, your trusted source for shipping, packaging, and warehouse supplies. For nearly 20 years, they've helped Canadian businesses thrive with fast, reliable service and a commitment to integrity and efficiency. Getting the products you need when you need them has never been easier. Now, let's talk about something real. With the latest round of tariffs coming from south of the border, supporting Canadian manufacturers and supply vendors isn't just good for business, it's good for Canada. So why keep funneling money to US giants like Uline when you can get the same or better quality products right here at home? When you choose Conquest Distributors, you're not just getting top-tier packaging, shipping, and warehouse essentials at competitive prices. You're investing in local businesses, strengthening Canadian supply chains, and keeping economic power here at home where it belongs. With fast, reliable fulfillment, an easy-to-use online store, and a team that genuinely cares about your success, Conquest Distributors proves that Canadian businesses can compete and win on quality and service. And now, to make it even easier, Toronto Talks listeners get to enjoy 15% off their first online order with promo code TALK15. Head on over to conquestdistributors.ca and see for yourself. That's conquestdistributors.ca, your trusted business supply partners. Now, back to the show. So, before we talk about jobs being lost or created, I wanted to pause on something quieter. Because a lot of people will tell you their work has actually gotten easier in some ways. Better tools, less drudgery, more efficiency. On paper. And yet, they don't feel more secure or more grounded because of it.
That tension is real, and it shows up consistently in the data. Surveys across sectors show that workers generally appreciate automation when it removes drudgery. People report higher efficiency, less frustration, and better performance when AI acts as a tool rather than a replacement. But at the same time, those very same workers express anxiety about displacement, even when nothing in their day-to-day role feels immediately threatened.
Right. So, even positive experiences with automation don't seem to calm the deeper unease. If anything, they sharpen it. The work feels smoother, but the horizon still feels foggier.
Exactly. And that's because meaning isn't just about what you're doing today. It's about whether you believe what you're doing still fits into a future that makes sense. Automation can improve the present while quietly destabilizing the future narrative. You feel useful now, but provisional. And once that sense of being temporarily useful creeps in, it doesn't just affect motivation, it changes how people understand the value of their own contribution. Because contribution isn't only economic, it's moral, it's social. It's whether you can tell a story to yourself and to others about why your work deserves recognition, respect, and continuity. And that story is getting harder to tell.
All right, Sophie, let me start with this because it keeps coming up constantly. If automation is making work more efficient, even more satisfying in some cases, why do so many people still describe their work as feeling invisible?
That's the abstraction problem. As work becomes more digital, more mediated, and more removed from physical outputs, its social visibility declines. People struggle to explain what they actually produce. And when contribution can't be clearly narrated, when you can't point to a tangible outcome, it starts to feel less real, even when it's economically essential.
Right. So even when value is there, the story of that value gets harder to tell and harder to recognize socially. Is that where usefulness and recognition start to drift apart?
Exactly. Public perception research shows that many new digital economy roles are viewed as lower in social value or prestige than traditional analog counterparts, even when they're better paid. A nurse, a teacher, a tradesperson, their contribution is legible. A data analyst, content moderator, systems optimizer, far less so. The work matters, but its meaning isn't obvious from the outside.
And when society can't easily see why your work matters, it's not a big leap for people to start wondering whether they matter inside the system at all. Is that part of why the bullshit jobs idea resonates so strongly?
Yes, even though the empirical picture is mixed. Some polls suggest large minorities feel their job lacks meaningful contribution. More rigorous European surveys put that share much lower, often in the single digits and not clearly rising over time. But the emotional resonance of that claim matters because perception shapes legitimacy, not just measurement.
Right. So even if fewer people technically hold meaningless jobs, the narrative suggests the fear of meaninglessness still changes behavior. What does that do to how people relate to their work?
Meaning is relational. If people believe their work could disappear tomorrow without consequence or that no one would notice, dignity erodes regardless of actual utility. The work still functions, the system still runs, but the moral story thins. People stop seeing their effort as part of something durable, and once that moral story weakens, the link between effort and reward starts to feel arbitrary again. Compensation stops feeling earned in a way people can recognize or defend. Resentment grows, not necessarily toward work itself, but toward the system that assigns value without explanation or acknowledgement.
Yeah. What's striking is that meaning doesn't seem to depend primarily on what people actually do, but on how the work is structured and experienced, right?
That's right. Autonomy and respect are powerful meaning multipliers. Workers report higher purpose when their judgment matters, when they're trusted, when their contribution is acknowledged. Even less glamorous roles can feel meaningful under those conditions.
Yeah, and the inverse is just as true. Even high-status work can feel hollow when people are tightly monitored, interchangeable, or treated as disposable.
Which is where abstraction becomes dangerous. When work is mediated through layers of software, metrics, and optimization, people lose the thread between action and impact. The work still produces results, but its moral justification weakens.
And once people can't explain why their work deserves reward, to themselves or to others, the scoreboard starts to feel arbitrary again.
That's the internal version of the scoreboard crisis. A society full of workers who can't articulate why their contribution matters is a society drifting toward moral instability, even if employment remains high and productivity continues to rise, which is an unstable place for any society to sit. Because people don't stop working, they stop believing, they comply, they perform, but they disengage emotionally. And when meaning decays quietly like that, dignity erodes without triggering alarms. Not mass unemployment, but contribution without conviction.
And once work stops providing a credible answer to the question, why do I matter? That question doesn't disappear.
It migrates into identity, into status, into resentment, into politics. Which brings us to the next fracture, because when meaning collapses inside work, people go searching for worth elsewhere, and not all substitutes are safe.
What you just laid out about meaning really sharpens something else that's been sitting uncomfortably in the background. Because even when people are working, even when productivity is high, there's a growing sense that the rewards of the work are flowing somewhere else entirely.
They are. Across many advanced economies, the labour share of income has declined while profit and capital shares have risen. That means a larger portion of value added is being captured not through wages, but through profits, rents, and returns to ownership. People can be contributing to growth and still feel locked out of its rewards. So even if the economy is expanding, the traditional promise that growth shows up in paychecks feels weaker. And that alone starts to strain the wage-based social contract, because that contract assumed a tight coupling. Firms grow, workers benefit. But today, value increasingly accrues through intangible assets, software, data, IP, networks, brand. These assets scale without proportional hiring. A company can double revenue without doubling headcount, sometimes without adding anyone at all.
Right. Which helps explain why people feel like the system is working, just not for them. The scoreboard still moves, it just doesn't seem to connect to payroll anymore.
Exactly. When value creation decouples from employment, wages stop functioning as the primary distribution mechanism. Growth continues, GDP rises, but participation feels conditional, and that gap between contribution and compensation becomes morally charged.
Yeah, and that moral charge matters. Because people aren't just tracking income, they're tracking fairness. They're asking whether effort still buys a legitimate claim on the system's success.
And increasingly, the answer feels ambiguous. Not because people aren't contributing, but because contribution no longer guarantees access to the upside.
Alright, Sophie, let me start with this. When people hear that the labor share is falling while profits are rising, it can sound abstract. What does that actually mean in lived terms for how value is moving through the system?
It means that a growing share of economic value is no longer flowing through wages. In many advanced economies, more of what firms produce is captured as profits, rents, or returns to capital, rather than payroll. So even when productivity rises, workers don't necessarily see proportional gains. The economy can grow while the wage-based channel of distribution weakens.
Right. So growth doesn't disappear, but the way that people participate in that growth changes. And that already puts strain on the old social contract. So how much of that shift is tied to the rise of intangibles, things like software, data, IP, rather than traditional labor?
A lot of it. Intangible assets now dominate the valuation of large firms. Software, algorithms, proprietary data, brands, and networks scale differently than factories or labor forces. Once built, they can generate enormous value without proportional hiring. A firm can grow revenue dramatically while adding very few workers or none at all. That explains why people feel like the scoreboard is still moving, but payroll isn't keeping pace. Platforms are the clearest manifestation. They replace employment with access. Workers aren't hired, they're onboarded. They're governed by ratings, algorithms, and terms they don't set. The platform captures a cut, scales efficiently, and shifts risk downward. Participation expands, but protection shrinks.
Got it. So people are included, but on very different terms. Less security, less leverage, less claim on the upside. And then there's IP, which you've compared before to land. Can you unpack that for us a bit?
IP increasingly behaves like a rent-producing asset. If you own the algorithm, the patent, the network, or the dataset, you collect returns repeatedly. If you don't, you work around it. This concentrates value in ownership rather than contribution. People may create enormous value inside systems they don't own and can't influence. That distinction feels crucial. Creating value versus capturing value. And it's where perceived unfairness accelerates, even if GDP keeps rising. People can sense when the upside is structurally unreachable. When growth accrues upstream, effort downstream starts to feel extractive rather than participatory. That's when trust erodes, not because the economy is failing, but because its rewards no longer feel morally legible.
Right, so even in a good economy, legitimacy can decay. Which brings us back to the hard question underneath all of this. If value keeps scaling without hiring, can wages alone still carry the system's sense of fairness?
Probably not. That's why policy conversations are re-emerging around taxation, redistribution, bargaining power, and ownership models. Not as ideology, but as attempts to rebuild alignment between contribution and reward in a system where employment is no longer the primary distribution channel.
So this isn't just about inequality in the abstract. It's about whether the primary way people participate through work still grants them a meaningful stake in the system they sustain.
And increasingly, it doesn't, because wages alone can't carry legitimacy anymore. If value keeps scaling without hiring, the old tools stop working, and pretending otherwise just deepens the fracture. The question isn't whether growth continues, it's whether participation remains meaningful. A system can be efficient and still feel extractive. It can be innovative and still feel closed.
Right. And when people feel locked out of the value they helped create, the scoreboard doesn't just feel unfair, it starts to feel rigged.
Which is dangerous. Because once people believe the system rewards ownership over contribution and access over dignity, they don't stop working, but they stop believing the game is worth playing. And that belief gap doesn't stay economic for long. It metastasizes. It spills into identity, politics, and social cohesion. Because when value capture loses legitimacy, people go looking for other ways to assert worth. And not all of them are constructive.
Yeah, and that brings us to the final question this episode has been circling around from the beginning.
If work no longer guarantees dignity, meaning, or a claim on the future, what does?
Here are the top 6 reasons why smart Toronto businesses choose Conquest over Uline. We were going to do a top 5 list, but truth is, doing a little extra is kind of our thing. Number 6, we offer free shipping. Uline doesn't. I mean, it doesn't really get any simpler than that, does it? Number 5, we've got 35 5-star Google reviews from real customers. They've got Yelp, Trustpilot, and Glassdoor reviews that read like corporate horror fiction. Number 4, we're actually in the GTA. Uline, they're out in Milton, aka delivery purgatory. We ship like your time matters, because it does. Number 3, we are proudly all Canadian. Our customers, suppliers, even our platform, Uline, they're one of America's biggest employers. Stars and stripes to the core. Number 2, our carbon footprint is essentially non-existent. Remote operations, no warehouses, and definitely no junk mail catalogs from the Jurassic period. And reason number 1, Uline infamously offer their free hats and barbecue sauce. We, on the other hand, offer real savings, fast service, and actual value. Before we jump to conclusions, I want to slow this down and pull the lens back a bit, because whenever a system feels broken, there's a temptation to declare it unprecedented. But history usually complicates that instinct, right?
It does. History doesn't promise outcomes, it reveals mechanisms. And one of the clearest mechanisms we see across prior transitions is lag. Productivity surges first, distribution follows later if institutions adapt. That framing matters. It's not that history guarantees a soft landing, it's that it shows us how landings were made survivable before and what failed when they weren't. Industrialization, electrification, digitization all produced enormous gains, but none of them distributed those gains automatically. Wages lagged productivity for decades in some cases. Social conflict rose. Alignment only came after labour rights, education systems and safety nets were rebuilt to match the new productive reality.
So the pattern isn't technology fixes things, it's technology breaks alignment and institutions either catch up or they don't.
Yes. New technology layered onto old institutions produces misalignment. New technology paired with updated institutions produces shared gains. That distinction explains most of the variance in historical outcomes.
So here's where the moment starts to feel different and heavier. Because AI isn't just speeding up tasks or replacing muscle. It's reaching directly into cognitive work, judgment, and coordination. And it's doing so faster and more broadly than prior waves.
That's the break. Previous transitions displaced labour categories. This one resorts people: who gets amplified, who gets automated, who becomes complementary, and who becomes redundant. And because value is increasingly captured through IP, platforms and scale, the rewards may concentrate faster than institutions can respond. So even if history rhymes, the tempo has changed. The lag might be shorter but sharper, and the cost of delay higher. Productivity can surge while payroll stagnates. Satisfaction can rise in the short term while meaning erodes underneath. People may feel busy, even useful, while quietly losing confidence that their contribution actually matters.
Which brings us to the uncomfortable pivot. Because if the old scoreboard no longer reflects contribution, we're forced to ask a question that feels almost taboo in economic conversations. What actually counts as useful now?
That's the core question. Contribution can no longer be defined narrowly as output per hour. Caregiving, coordination, judgment, creativity, stewardship. These are forms of value that don't scale cleanly, but societies collapse without them.
And yet, most of those forms of contribution still sit off the scoreboard. Poorly compensated, poorly measured, often invisible, even as they become more essential.
Which is why the hard claim matters. If the scoreboard stays broken, people won't just complain about outcomes, they'll reject the game itself. At first quietly, eventually structurally.
Right, so this isn't just a question about jobs or wages or efficiency. It's about dignity, and whether people can still see themselves and each other as meaningfully contributing into a shared system.
And that leaves us with a real fork in the road. Either we redesign incentives, ownership, and institutional recognition to match how value is actually created now, or we normalize a permanent divide between those the system upgrades and those it discards. History is blunt about this part. When contribution loses meaning, participation becomes conditional, compliance turns transactional, and social trust starts to thin, even if the economy keeps running. Because systems don't fail when they stop producing. They fail when they stop making sense to the people inside them.
Which brings us back to a question we can't keep deferring. One legitimacy can't answer on its own. If productivity no longer guarantees reward and reward no longer proves value, what does?
Attention. Attention becomes the shortcut to legitimacy, income, and identity. But the scroll is exhausting everyone, and the incentives are turning corrosive. Next episode, we look at what happens when attention stops being currency and starts being poison.
That's it for the show. Like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and reach out to us anytime at talk@torontotalks.ca. We'll see you next time right here on Toronto Talks, where big ideas come to life
And curiosity never sleeps.